This week, I'm delighted to be joined by television executive Danny Cohen, who's president of Access Entertainment. Danny began his television career at Channel 4 between 2000 and 2007 as the head of documentaries and the head of E4. He then went on to become controller of BBC Three for 3 years and controller of BBC One for a further 3 years, before in 2013 becoming director of BBC Television, standing down in 2015. So after such a distinguished career at the BBC, he's then gone on to be quite critical of the corporation, particularly in his columns for The Telegraph, where he makes allegations of bias against the broadcaster in the area of reporting on Israel and Gaza. So, Danny, lots to talk about. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
So, Danny, if we can start by just talking about your time at the BBC,
Sure.
what things were like then in your sort of 10 or 15 years there?
Do you mean specifically in terms of Israel, anti-Semitism, and so on, or yeah,
Yes, and culturally, I mean,
yeah,
it always strikes me that the perceived bias on Israel and anti-Semitism comes from a culture in the BBC that's broader than just anti-Semitism, that extends towards a general liberal bias. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. I wondered what things were like those years ago, whether it was different then or whether it's the same.
yeah. So I first thing says I didn't directly experience anti-Semitism when I was there from within the BBC. I experienced a fair amount of anti-Semitism from outside the BBC, some social media and so on. The kind of typical, anti-Semitic tropes around Jews controlling the media and all of those kinds of things. So there was a fair amount of that, but nothing inside the BBC. I think there's a general point I'd probably make when you're in very senior roles, and it's probably true of very senior roles across business. When you're in a very senior role, you're the boss. People are very nice to you in general, and I had a couple of experiences actually where I found out that someone I liked and I thought was a very good, nice person was actually a bully, and I found it a bit distressing in a way because you think someone's nice, then you find out about them and you realise they've just been sort of managing up quite successfully.
So they're bullying other people below them,
Yeah,
but being
yeah,
nice to you. Yeah, I see.
yeah. So it kind of illustrated to me that when you're doing those jobs, you don't always get to see a 360 view of people or indeed an organisation. You get a kind of filtered version based on hierarchy, and so in general, people treated me. I mean, there was some, you always have some challenges in doing those kind of jobs, and you get some decisions right and some wrong. But in general, I didn't experience it directly there. I didn't have a great deal of engagement with news, really more around panoramas and documentaries. I had a very good relationship with James Harding as head of BBC News, who now runs Tortoise, and actually Helen Boding and so on. So I had good relationships there, and I felt I was able to speak quite frankly. I wasn't there in a period, I arrived just as the kind of Gaza, for the 2008 challenges between Israel and Gaza and so on taking place. If I got my dates right. And I left before obviously way before any of the recent horrors happened. So I wasn't there in a particularly contentious period when it came to Israel.
But you stood down in 2015, and there was a Gaza conflict in 2014, wasn't there?
Yeah.
As I recall. And there must have been,
Yeah.
and before then, there was, I suppose, the Intifada would have been over and done with. So it was generally corresponded with a period of relative peace, but
Yeah, relative peace.
nonetheless.
You're right, and you're right about because there's Intifada before that. So you're right. The Gaza thing. I listen. Maybe people who are studying it more carefully remember. I don't remember huge amounts of problems around that Gaza invasion, but I don't remember them. There may have been, but I don't. To be frank, I don't recall it.
And I mean, is your sense that the problems that we're seeing now were always there, but just deeply embedded, a bit like when the Brexit referendum was called and suddenly it exposed a lot of stuff that was in the country? Or do you
Yeah.
think that actually the culture has changed via different people coming in, whatever it is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it was Johnny Friedland said that events from October 7th onwards have been like a flare going up in the country,
Mm.
and you can see a lot of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias that was there, but we didn't know was there. Uh, and I think that is true. I found that generally in the country in my experience. And I think that's true, probably true of some at the BBC as well. I also think there are senior management there who, at the best, are dealing with it, and at the worst, may be okay with it. So,
Right.
or insufficiently bothered by it. So I think like all these things is a complex of issues,
Mm.
and that's creating the particular problems we're seeing at the BBC. But yeah, I think it's probably a combination of both. But I think it is symptomatic of what I think many Jewish people have been feeling since 7th October. There was a fair amount of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism out there that they couldn't see. The question for all of us, I think, is how you unsee it. And now we
Right.
see it post October the 7th. How do you
But I
unsee
mean,
it?
right. But before we get to that, let's talk about what the it is.
Yeah.
Because the BBC continues to be very defensive about allegations
Mm,
of bias on Israel.
mm,
This, for me, since I've been editing the JC, is something that we've been focusing on quite a lot, campaigning on,
mm,
particularly with BBC Arabic, which
mm,
you know, it, in on average, it's upheld a complaint of one per week since
mm,
2021. That's even before October the 7th. And there have been
mm,
some extraordinary cases
mm,
of anti-Israel hatred on BBC
mm,
Arabic. I mean, one that comes to mind was a guy who was given a platform on a kind of sofa show. He played
mm,
the oud and sang a terrorist song, and it was sort of
mm,
embraced and celebrated. Obviously,
mm,
since October the 7th, it's become even worse. BBC Arabic, of course, has been a cesspit, repeatedly interviewing, for example, a former PLO general who celebrated October the 7th as a heroic military miracle,
mm,
and who's previously attacked Israel from Lebanon. But there's lots and lots of other examples. In JC, we ran a timeline recently. So everything from, the Al Ahli hospital that was reported as an Israeli strike, but wasn't, up until, other numerous examples of bias and misreporting, and including, of course, not calling Hamas terrorists, whereas the IRA are often referred to as terrorists on the BBC. So, but when we've reported on this, the BBC have been very defensive. They've always gone into a defensive crouch, a state of denial, often attacking us or refusing to respond for our deadlines, not working with us in any kind of cooperative way. And there's a sense when speaking to BBC executives, including Tim Davie, that they feel that we have something against them that's part of the culture wars, that it's not genuine concern about anti-Semitism there, but it's somehow us attacking them because we're right wing or something like that. And so there seems to be evasion, defensiveness, denial, and a lack of movement. And even when they have made changes on BBC Arabic, for example, improvements, they haven't told us about it. They haven't done it publicly. They've kept it quiet. They don't want to admit any kind of flaw, even the ones that they're fixing or trying to fix. What's your reading of all this? What's going on? What actually is at the heart of the problem at the moment?
Oh, it's a lot to unpack there, Jake. So I think BBC Arabic tells us a number of things, some of which you've mentioned. It tells us that the BBC has a problem with anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias. I wrote a column for the Telegraph a few weeks ago, which noted that 80 corrections that have been made on BBC Arabic since October the 7th. Those are just the ones that have been spotted. I'm sure it's many more in reality. And of course, since then, there will have been many more.
And actually, sorry to interrupt, but we found that even the ones that were upheld, they didn't do the corrections on them
Right.
online. Sometimes they
Yeah.
left it for a long time or didn't do them at all.
Yeah. You've had journalists there, at least one I'm aware of, there'll be more, who celebrated October the 7th in one form or another. One of them, supported a tweet which called October the 7th the morning of hope. So if you've got an environment where you've got that many corrections, you've got that degree of problem of bias, you've got journalists there who supported the attacks, and you can't even publicly acknowledge as a publicly funded organization that you've got a problem, there's a problem. And I don't think you can solve any problem unless you recognize you've got one. And the BBC won't even recognize they've got one. And that to me is very damning in itself, because if it was a private organization, you could argue it's no one else's business, but we all pay for the BBC. We all know its public impact. So in a way, you see in what's happening in BBC Arabic, a lot of the oh, I've lost you. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. In a way, you see with BBC Arabic, a lot of the problems you see more widely across the BBC, anti-Semitism, anti-Israel bias, a failure of management to effectively deal with it, and a failure of management to effectively acknowledge there is a problem. And after this amount of time and this amount of problems, the fact that that hasn't even been acknowledged, I think, is really bad. And as we know, the problems continue. So for me, it just sums up a fundamental problem we've got with the BBC at the moment, that you've got both a top-down and a bottom-up problem. So the bottom-up part of it is you've got individual journalists showing bias, celebrating a massacre, repeated failures of impartiality. And from the top, you've got a senior management failure to effectively deal with it and acknowledge it. Right. And that's very serious. Because if you have a situation where in a large organization mistakes happen, but management accept, acknowledge it, and you can see they're fixing it, you might feel differently about it. But at no point have I felt there's been a recognition of the problem and a transparent conversation publicly with the Jewish community about what the problem is and what they're doing about it.
Now, so what you're saying really is that there are two sort of baskets of problems. There's the bias itself, and then there's the denial of the bias, or the inability to affect,
and the failure to fix it. Yeah, the failure to fix it.
Yeah, and these are two related problems, but there's little subgroups within there. So, for example, you talked about employees of the BBC who have celebrated October the 7th on social media. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be producing biased reporting. I mean, the likelihood is they probably will, but you know, that's a personal matter on their personal accounts, that the BBC's, being a massive organisation, might say, well, we can't keep tabs on every single employee all the time. Accidents will happen. I guess what I'm saying is that... Sorry,
I had to interrupt you. Of course, it's not an accident when you celebrate October the 7th. And why are those people still working there? So you're right. You can say we can't, monitor everyone's social media in advance. We can't be following it in real time. It's a very large organisation. That's all fair and correct. If, however, 8 months after someone has celebrated October the 7th and they're still working for the BBC, what does that tell us? It tells us they don't take it seriously. Now, the way the BBC sometimes handles this is to say, we can't comment on individual cases, HR, legals, all of those kind of things. Two things I say about that. Perhaps the BBC's obligation to people who pay for it and licensing payers can sometimes be more important than that when someone celebrated a massacre. And the second thing is, I know about, as probably we all do, have worked in businesses, HR processes. If you've got someone who's celebrated a terrorist massacre, it should not take 8 months to deal with the problem. And if you've just given someone a rap over the knuckles for celebrating a terrorist massacre and said, go ahead, keep reporting, that's clearly unacceptable and deeply offensive to many Jewish people.
Right. I mean, this is just to give you an example of a message I received from a very senior BBC journalist, a sort of household name BBC journalist that I was corresponding with because they were cross about a BBC story we did. They wrote, the JC's coverage of the BBC has been to emphasise the negative and the damaging rather than to recognise the complexities involved, as well as, yes, highlighting mistakes or simply disagreements. I know the community is scared and angry, but simply playing back that anger to them isn't always serving them well. What do you make of that kind of feeling?
I've received that kind of thing. It's almost like blaming the people who are highlighting your problems with impartiality. I mean, it really is. It's like saying we are very specifically. It's not just people aren't just shouting. People like myself and what you've been doing, and other people have been pointing out very specific, repeated, and consistent instance of bias. And the reaction, it seems to be, you're the problem for pointing it out. I find that I think that could only happen in an organisation as insular as the BBC, that you face legitimate criticism with specific examples and you're then blamed for pointing them out, and you're the problem. It's kind of remarkable. I think that's what they come up with. On the complexity point, of course, it's complex. Every one of these things is complex, but in the end, that does not excuse it. I've heard someone else saying recently, well, we're getting 99%, we're getting it right 99% of the time. Well, that's a bit like, I don't beat my wife 99% of the time. It doesn't excuse it. It's not, It doesn't excuse it when the examples of bias are so egregious and you have such a level of public responsibility. So I think I've had that as well, Joe. I think this notion of you are the problem because you're very specifically pointing it out and it's making it harder for us. Sort it out, and none of us would be saying this anymore. I mean, that's the thing. If it was sorted out, we'd all stop talking and writing about it.
It feels to me I've done a bit of work at the BBC over the years, and I've had bits and pieces to do with the BBC. I mean, it feels to me like no BBC journalist gets up in the morning and thinks, right, I'm going to dispense with impartiality today. I'm going to do a biased job because it's Israel. I think it is a matter of error in terms of the expression of bias, maybe if not the poor reaction to it, the denial and so on. But it strikes me that whenever there is a mistake, it always goes in one direction. And that's the problem, isn't it?
I think that's right. I think some journalists, perhaps in BBC Arabic, do wake up with that intention. So I think that's not true of all of BBC. I also think that there's a lot of willful blindness. There's a lot of error by omission. There's a lot of focus on this conflict at the expense of other very serious things going on around the world. If you compare the volume of reporting on what is a terrible war for both sides in Gaza and the starvation going on in Sudan, and you compare the level of coverage, I mean, it tells you a lot. And the BBC should not just feel like it has to follow the story everyone else is following. It should set the agenda, not follow the agenda. So I think you see it in that as well, and I think it's not. I think it's not simply errors. So if, for example, just giving one example that I noticed in one of my columns, there was one of the live blog pages on BBC News about the Harvard and Columbia and US university campus protests. I think it was something like 59 updates during the day, and one update covered the Jewish experience of anti-Semitism in that world. Now, what is that? Is that just an error? Or is that something more that's a kind of a bias, a decision, conscious or otherwise, by a team to focus on one perspective and not the other? So I think putting it down to simply errors doesn't give you the full picture around error of omission, lack of impartiality, lack of showing both sides to things. So I think it's deeper than that, I'm afraid.
I mean, it's funny because at every turn it seems simple, but then once you begin to pin it down, it's quite evasive. So, for example, talking about the focus on the Israel Palestine conflict at the expense of all other conflicts in the world. I mean, Yemen, for example, 400,000 people killed. 10 million kids starving, or whatever it is, a figure like that. And has received almost no airplay on the BBC until the Houthis attack Israel. But then at the same time, if you ask any working BBC journalist that, they'll say, well, that's what people want. It's like any other, like the reason why we focus on some conflicts more than others.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I don't think that fully describes the BBC's mission to inform and educate, which is its fundamental mission. It's something I actually noticed when I visited the newsroom when I was there. I was always interested. They were very, very interested in what the newspapers were reporting that day, and they were. I don't know if it's still the same. Probably cuts it, but it's all online anyway. There were the UK daily newspapers everywhere, and they kind of were following a framework of the news agenda for the country. And I mean, I said to people a few times, I just wouldn't have newspapers in the BBC newsroom. You decide what the news agenda is. You don't need to say what's in the Mail or the Guardian or the Telegraph or the Sun to understand it. That you are one of the world's largest news organisations. You have a different set of purposes to a commercial news organisation. You decide what the news agenda should be and its order of priority. So I think that's actually something more deep rooted about a feeling that they have to sort of follow what other people are doing and what the public say. That the BBC's public purposes can be different to that.
In fact, that brings on to the next question I wanted to ask you, which was that I did a podcast a few months ago with Alan Rusbridger and Lionel Barber about the BBC bias. And they were talking about the Al Ahli hospital incident, which I mentioned earlier, where it was bombed by Islamic Jihad and it was accusing of Israel. And they said, did it show something about the BBC? And I said, I thought it did. And they then produced evidence of numerous reports across the media, Daily Mail and elsewhere, right and left, that had made the same mistake. And certainly the BBC's attitude seems to be reflected in CNN, in other liberally dominated broadcasters, if not always in the press. Do you think that there's something specific about the BBC that makes it particularly offensive and egregious and problematic? Or do you think that it's a wider problem in the media as a whole?
Listen, there are errors of reporting made everywhere. I think the BBC's bar must and should be higher. And partly because its impact is so much bigger, and partly because it's a public organisation we all fund. So yes, I think it is higher. I mean, just to note, the same journalist that was involved in that misreporting was involved in a story that the BBC made very prominent last week about water supplies in Gaza, with a very big photo at the top of the article about a poor child who looked very starved and very thirsty. And it emerged during that morning that actually the poor kid had cerebral palsy, I think it was, and that wasn't even mentioned in the article. Interestingly, because you're talking about other news sources, CBC in Canada did a similar story and made that very clear. So some people knew what was going on. The mother of that child was even reported in that story saying he was completely well, I think, I'm paraphrasing, until the war started. So it was immensely factually accurate and misleading. And I think the newsroom became aware of it, and there was a lot of rejigging, re-emphasizing, reprioritizing the article, just with a correction at the end. There was no attempt by the BBC to admit the error or do anything. You'd have to read to the end of the news story to find this correction. And by then, most people have read the story because it was later in the day. So that was the same journalist. And I think it tells you that things like Al Ahli don't happen in a bubble. And they've been part of a consistent pattern of problems, which, as you say, almost entirely point in one direction.
Yes, I mean, and that actually reminds me of something that isn't to do with Israel directly, which is the Hanukah incident a couple of years ago, where there was that bus of kids being attacked, and the BBC. The thing about that was that the BBC reported that there were racial slurs said from inside the bus, and then when it was contested, didn't do what the BBC would normally do, which would be to say it's been contested. There are two sides to this story. They insisted and they stuck with their factual for many months, and then the investigation found against them. And I can't imagine them digging their heels in that way with any other type of story at all.
No. That's right. That's right. And you can't imagine them dealing with some of these things around racism if it was, around the Black community or the Muslim community in the same way. You just can't imagine. Can you imagine if God forbid there'd been a terrible massacre of members of the Black community, and a BBC journalist horrifically celebrated that and supported social media? Do we really believe they'd still be employed by the BBC 8 months later? I just can't. I can't imagine it. I just can't. And rightly so. They wouldn't. They shouldn't be. So yeah, I think there are a lot of differences. I think David Baddiel said it very well way before this started, in that kind of the Jews don't count thing. There is a different treatment.
Yeah, and you see it with the errors. I mean, even before October the 7th, when there was an operation in Jenin that killed 0 civilians. A couple of the terrorists were under the age of 18, were 17, or the presenter said that the IDF was happy to kill children.
Yeah.
When you had just the other day when there was a hostage rescue, the BBC presenter putting to the former IDF spokesman that wouldn't it have been a better idea to have warned people that they were going to do a surprise raid. And then of course there was that other incident where the BBC was forced to apologise when the IDF entered Shifa Hospital, and they reported that they were targeting people, including medical teams and Arab speakers, when the actual truth was that they had sent in medical teams and Arabic speakers to
Yeah,
help the civilians
yeah,
there. So
yeah.
look, all of
I
this,
mean,
I mean,
Jake,
yeah,
just the ones we've talked about on this podcast, just the volume we've talked about in the last few minutes is enough for them should be able to recognise we have a problem,
yeah,
and maybe the Jewish community could help them solve that problem with advice, guidance, understanding, if they at least acknowledged they had one and wanted to fix it. But I think ultimately the management of the BBC feel like they're managing their way through a reputational crisis,
mm,
and
mm,
that's what they're managing rather than
right,
managing and resolving an issue of racism and bias. And I've been in that position myself. A number of times when you're there, there's a lot of incoming fire. Excuse the metaphor, and you often managing issues around reputation. And you can sometimes get into a headspace where managing the crisis is the most important thing and getting through it and
mm,
manage and not doing anything which too badly damages the reputation of the BBC.
yeah.
And I think that's one of the fundamental issues that management feel like they're managing their way through a crisis they hope to get it to the other side of, rather than resolving a very serious and disturbing issue of impartiality, anti-Israel bias, and anti-Jewish racism.
So they're seeing it as a PR exercise or reputational
Yeah,
damage limitation exercise rather
yeah,
than an actual root and branch problem.
yeah.
So
I think
if you
that's
were,
part of
yeah.
the problem. Yeah.
Mm. So sorry, my camera just disappeared. Uh,
Okay.
there we are. I'm back. So just the final question I wanted to ask you then, really, which is that if you were back as director of television or even director general, if the BBC was yours, how would you turn it around? What does the BBC need to do to turn this one around?
I think the first thing I'd probably have to say is that, if I had been there, left a number of years for this, but if I had been there in the aftermath of October 7th, I wouldn't be there now. I'd have had to resign. Um, I think I'd probably, I wrote very early on the 8th of October about their refusal to use the word terrorist. And actually, Telegraph put that on the front page, which surprised me. And I think that it got a lot of pick up from other people, Prime Minister and others during that week. I think I'd have probably had to resign on that point. I mean, after what happened, that unwillingness to call a clear terrorist act a terrorist act, I think I couldn't have. I don't think I could have sustained my position as a member of the BBC board at that point, which you are doing that job, because I wouldn't have had responsibility for news. I'm on the overall board of the BBC, was on the board of the BBC, which has overall responsibility for its output, and I just don't think it would have been sustainable. So I think I wouldn't have been by this point if I had been there.
Can I just interrupt you on
Yeah,
that point?
yeah.
What do you think it says about the other senior members of BBC management that they didn't resign? Do you think they should have resigned?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, none of the others are Jewish. There's no other senior Jewish person, and then I think that's probably part of the problem. We've also seen a thing of senior managers at the BBC who are not Jewish telling Jewish employees what is and isn't anti-Semitism. Again, I don't believe that would happen. If I don't believe they would tell um, another person from an ethnic minority or another religion what isn't racism against them. It just wouldn't happen. But apparently, that's okay to do with anti-Semitism and Jews when you're not Jewish. So I don't know. I don't know whether anyone would have or should
But
have.
it's ironic, isn't it? Because they're so big on diversity. We had this
Yeah,
story the other day of you can't get into the BBC as easily if you're white anymore, and they're keen to get people of different ethnic minorities into senior positions. But
yeah,
even when they've got this big problem with bias against Jews and anti-Semitism,
yeah.
they're not interested. It seems I haven't, as far as I haven't heard, of getting any Jews into senior positions to help with that.
Or anyone who has clearly been criticising them to really have some kind of input into what they're doing. I don't really think that's something. I
Mm.
think that there've been a series of meetings I'm aware of which have been to me, from everything I've heard about them, hearing but not listening exercises, and being able to say that they've met members of the community and so on, but nothing. I think the fact that nothing really's changed tells you whether they were really listening in those meetings.
So, so, so
So
if you were, let's say you weren't there after October 7th, but they brought you in tomorrow to
yeah,
become director general and to
yeah,
sort the place out, what
yeah.
needs to be done? What can be done?
Okay. I won't ever be Director General of the BBC, and I don't have an appetite, don't
Not
have a
after this
desire,
podcast.
no, I don't have a desire to. So this is a purely
Yeah.
theoretical conversation because it's not in my my plan in life. I think first of all, you have to, as I said, you have to recognise you've got a problem. Second of all, I think you have to have an independent investigation into failures of impartiality and anti-Israel bias at the BBC in its reporting. I think you have to have a separate independent investigation into incidents of anti-Semitism that BBC Jewish staff have experienced. I think that's something else you need to do. I think there has to be a wholesale rewriting of the social media guidelines because they clearly are failing.
Have you sacked Gary Lineker?
I'm not going to give you that very easy soundbite, but I think what I've written about Gary is very clear. That I think he has been saying things which are very offensive to Jewish people, and I think have clearly breached the guidelines. But I think what happened, he's clearly done some deal with the BBC after that fallout, which gives him pretty much carte blanche. I mean, it's very clear the power rests with Gary Lineker and not the management of the BBC in their relationship. I mean, blatantly clear. I don't recall seeing such a failure of sort of a piece of having such control actually over management as Gary seems to have managed. So I think those are four things. There's probably more, but off the top of my head, those are four things that, they could start doing tomorrow. But I see no signs of it.
And do you think that there's a deeper problem of cultural lack of diversity in terms of people with a similar political worldview reinforcing themselves by recruiting people who are like them, even if they might be from different ethnicities, they're from a similar educational background or a similar worldview?
Yeah, listen, I think that is true. I mean, people used to say that about me when I was there. They didn't know how I voted, but they assumed I was a big lefty. So people come to assumptions they don't know. But yeah, I think there probably is a degree of that groupthink. I think there's a degree of groupthink in all large organizations. I think that is a problem there. And it's very interesting to see how that's playing out in lots of areas of public life at the moment.
Right, now, Dan, I've said last question already, but just one final add-on, if I may, just before I let you go. I know you're busy.
Yeah.
People who are very concerned about this, Jews, allies, other people of intact moral compass, what do they do? Do they just turn off the BBC and watch GB News? What should they do? Do they complain? How do they respond?
Yeah, I think the community, first of all, I think across all of these things, we need to show resilience. So, the challenges we're finding with anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism, they're not going to go away immediately when the fighting finally stops in Gaza. I think it's opened up something which is going to be around for a while, and we're seeing particularly the fact that a lot of younger people have views that I would personally find challenging. Means we're going to have resilience for a longer battle on different levels to fight anti-Zionism and anti-Israel bias and anti-Semitism. So that's the first thing I think we all need across the board. I think do keep complaining. Do keep complaining when you see things. Point out the errors. Point out the inaccuracies. Point out the bias. Because I think we just need to keep cataloguing this stuff. Because frankly, with every day that goes by, the case becomes stronger and stronger. And at some point, that case, I think, will break through in some way. I think we need to come together more often as a community and work together for ways in which we can sort of respond to that bias. Often, we tend to be in lots of different groups, lots of different organizations, and we need a more effective way of standing together. And I think we have to, and it's a very sad thing to have to say it. I think we're going to have to work hard to defend Israel's right to exist because we're seeing more and more people arguing amongst any other country in the world. Uniquely, Israel is the one that doesn't have a right to exist. And that's very sad, and it means we have to fight hard against that for as long as it takes.
Well, Danny Cohen, thank you so much for talking to us this week.
Thanks, Jay.